Welcome back. We're joined by Dr. Sahar Damaty, a financial and economic expert. Good evening to you, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. It's my pleasure.
Could you shed more light on the Decent Life Initiative? How can Decent Life Initiative boost human resources?
Well, actually, this initiative, from my point of view, is a project like no other projects whatsoever. Because it aims at improving the lives of the unprivileged Egyptians who lived like this for years. And actually, I will talk about it in 2 or 3, 4 points. The first point is the targets of the government. We have in Egypt right now 102 million population that primarily half of them are below the poverty level or a little bit more. And the initiative is meant and targeted to invest in human capital, ability of the village inhabitants themselves, and raise the quality of developing the services. This initiative is important. Why? Because it simulates development, builds the basic fundamental infrastructure, provide decent housing, and including.
Yes. During his speech.
Excuse me?
I'm sorry, I cut you off. If you want to continue on with what you were saying.
Yes, I mean, I'm just answering the question, right?
Yes.
So, okay. So it's, as I said, it's stimulating or providing access to clean water, sewage, sanitation, electricity, gas, communication. And not only that, we also have to speak about 13,000 schools, classrooms, expanding health facilities, hospitals, throughout all of the villages in Egypt, which account for approximately 4,500.
Yes.
And the budget for this is approximately 700 billion Egyptian pounds. More than 2,500 have been so far having what we call the proper and decent life. The government, the most important thing here is that the government started with the first villages that were below the 70% poverty level, and the second phase is between 50 and 70% poverty level, and finally the final phase, which is up to 50% poverty level, and they aim to finalize all of this within the next 2-3 years.
Yes. During his speech, the president spoke about the current economic crisis in the country, issuing a set of economic-related directives. Would you tell us more about these directives and how far are these directives leading the country to the right economic track? Okay.
We have to recognize first that we are going through 2 crises. COVID-19 crisis as well as the Ukraine crisis. And both of them have significant implications on the economies worldwide, not only in Egypt. So in order to pass by this crisis, especially during this period of time, the most important thing was to be able to be self-sufficient when it comes to major commodities like wheat. Egypt, as you know, used to depend primarily on Ukraine and Russia in order to import wheat. So what right now is happening is that the government not only is giving and providing incentives for the farmers in order to increase wheat production, but also to make sure that we have a good strategic reserve in place to overcome problem as such. Number 2, at this point in time, one of the major objectives of the reform process or the reform plan was to decrease subsidies. At this point in time, as I just mentioned before, we have a number of people, or around 50% below the poverty level, and accordingly you cannot cancel all the incentives at this time. Accordingly, the government instructed that all basic commodities nationwide will be subsidized until the end of this year.
Yes. What about your suggestions, Dr. Sahar? What do you think should be added to these directives when it comes to trying to maneuver out of this economic crisis?
to maneuver out of this economic crisis, also, I think we have to involve the private sector in the development process. And I believe that within the directives given by the President, his instruction was to make sure the private sector to participate in state-owned assets with a target of $10 billion per annum. So I think this is very important. My personal point of view is this is your question. What could be the prescription for the very short term and the longer term?
Yes.
My personal prescription is to decrease dependency on importations of major commodities, not to go through such a crisis again, to have a plan in place for every major commodity and what can we do about them and how can we achieve self-dependency. This is very important. We need to focus on exportation, to implement more appropriate procedures to attract foreign direct investment, including incentives. And not only incentive, also to continuously update and develop the legal framework governing the business transactions. Also, I believe that we need to implement a short-term financial plan to cover needs of the private sector. Another important objective would be to have a flexible, transparent foreign exchange system. Also on the financial sector, we as a country, we have 24 different tax systems.
Yes.
So what we need to do is to unify all of these different types of taxes. Another 2 points, decrease the level of consumption during this period of time, because by increasing actually interest rate, which is a very, very important thing to do to avoid, since the Fed is going to increase actually the interest rate up to the end of the year to become 2.8, and I heard lately that next meeting for the Federal Reserve are going to increase interest by 50 bps, which is tremendous.
Yes.
So we will have to increase interest rate again to avoid dollarization. So that's quite important.
Okay.
And also monitor the markets continuously.
Yes.
Make a lot of efforts in order to include a number of companies in stock exchange in order to strengthen our stock exchange and attract investors.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time. So Dr. Sahar Damaty, a financial and economic expert, thank you so much for joining us over the phone and shedding light on the possible economic directives that should be taken to move forward.